Once VAT is introduced on private school fees, there are a number of issues that schools will need to consider. And one of the big issues that's been asked is, what's the advantage of paying school fees in advance? Ordinarily, once VAT is introduced, advance payments trigger a tax point, and so therefore VAT is payable at the time the payment is made. However, what we don't know at this stage is whether there's going to be any special legislation introduced that changes the normal tax point rules. Certainly, I'm aware that some schools have actually asked parents to make payments in advance of the election to try and protect them from the addition of VAT. However, one of the things that we fully expect government to do is introduce what's called anti-forestalling legislation. This will mean that VAT will be payable on payments made from the date that the announcement is made, rather than when the VAT legislation is introduced, which will of course take some time. One of the practical issues that schools will need to consider is whether their contracts actually allow for the addition of VAT. Normally when a contract is silent on VAT, the amounts paid are treated as VAT inclusive. So that's a practical issue that some of the schools may need to consider. Once VAT is introduced, one of the issues that schools will need to do is to register for VAT. They'll need to do that at the correct time, of course, because if they don't register at the correct time, they could be liable to penalties. And once VAT registered, they'll need to consider whether they have any other income that's also liable to VAT, because those will have to be included in the VAT returns. The introduction of VAT doesn't necessarily mean that schools will have to pass on the full cost to the parents. One of the benefits of VAT registration and making taxable supplies is that the business will have entitlement to VAT recovery on costs associated with those educational activities. There may be some schools that have or continue to have some exempt income, for example from room lettings. Schools in that situation will be partly exempt and therefore have more complex partial exemption calculations to undertake as a result of their registration. Another big talking point has been the recovery of VAT on capital projects. Once VAT registered, any capital projects are subject to something called the capital goods scheme, which broadly means that the VAT registered entity has to consider the use of the building or capital project over a 10-year period. If they've incurred VAT on capital projects before registration, they may be able to go back retrospectively to reclaim a proportion of the VAT. And in fact, I'm aware that some schools have actually held back on capital projects until they're VAT registered, because being VAT registered will allow them to reclaim the VAT on those costs. A couple of practical issues that schools need to consider. First of all, they'll need to keep VAT records, and so therefore they may need to change either their accounting software and record keeping. They may also need to train their staff. Some of their staff won't have any VAT experience and therefore need help and support to compile and complete VAT returns. Unfortunately, until such time that the actual VAT legislation is introduced, no one knows for certain precisely what the impact will be. However, schools can take steps to try and mitigate the potential impact as far as possible, albeit at this stage it will be estimated rather than actual. Once the formal legislation is introduced, we will of course be contacting clients affected by the changes to help and support them through that process.